Greetings, this is Rick Ruby, the Nostalgic Catholic, with another Isaac Asimov short story review. This one is contained in the May 1974 issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And at least his name is on the cover here as another story by. His name's up here too. That is pertaining to a nonfiction because every issue of this from the beginning till, at least from very early on, till this point, I think probably almost till he ran out, always featured some short, non-story essay by him. That's what that is featuring. At closest range is the title of that particular essay. In this case, however, the story, which is what we are concerned with here, is at the very beginning, listed actually as a novelette, That Thou Art Mindful of Him, Isaac Asimov, page 4. Okay. So, you don't have to get very far to get to that. In fact, here we are. Once again, as is usual for fantasy and science fiction, there is no artwork. The cover is the only art, and this pertains to some other story. So, we don't have any artwork. We do have a blurb. So let's read the blurb. It says, "This, the first new Asimov robotics story in years, comes to you from the good doctor by way of an anthology titled Final Stage, edited by myself and Barry M. Maltzberg, to be published in May by Charterhouse. For Final Stage, we asked science fiction's most distinguished writers to contribute the ultimate story on one of a dozen classic SF themes, ranging from time travel to alternate worlds to robotics. There was only one choice for the latter, of course, and although all the other stories in Final Stage will be presented in the book for the first time, we reserve the right to publish this one first in Fantasy and Science Fiction. Enjoy." So most of the other stories in there therefore had first greet their audience in that volume called Final Stage. But this one comes out first here and then goes into Final Stage. So, That Thou Art Mindful of Him by Isaac Asimov starts by the 3 laws of robotics. So what have we got? We've got a growing problem here, and let's start with a little bit about this problem. Apparently, human beings are, this is written, we're looking at the middle 1970s just about, and yet somehow human beings are still totally preoccupied with this Frankenstein complex. They don't want robots around. They're afraid robots will take their place, hurt them in some way, turn on their creators, or something like that. Which, even by that time, that really didn't make any sense. Don't get me wrong. When Isaac Asimov decided to start writing robot stories, and we're talking about 1930, not late 39, when he started drafting his first robot story, and one of his earliest ones published, namely the Strange Playfellow, otherwise known as Robbie. There were out there maybe 2 other stories, one by Ian O. Bender with a title of I, Robot, believe it or not, and one other, the name of which I forget, and the author of which I forget, but I believe there were 2 other stories that portrayed robots in a sympathetic light. Other than those 2 exceptions, everything ever written about anything like a robot or a human being created, human-like creature, everything from Frankenstein's monster that was just a stitched together of dead bodies energized with an electric shock to every kind of robot, where the robots at some point end up turning on their creators, or the creation turns on its creator. It's like, why did you create me? I don't like that. I resent that fact, and I'm going to destroy you before I destroy myself. I guess. I don't know. At any rate, robots were always destructive things, and it was like, there are things man was not meant to know, and of course, always the wonderful combinations of clank, clank, and ah! And one of the things, of course, is he wanted to write a sympathetic story too. A couple other authors beat him to the punch. He may have been aware of them, but be all that as it may, he wanted to write his sympathetic story, robot story. And as time goes on, he would write a whole bunch of sympathetic robot stories. The stories we see in I, Robot, and some also in also more in the rest of the robots. And maybe a few others that will have come out after that one that people can find. And I'll have covered every one of them up to this point. And in all of these stories, it's quite clear the robots are not some nefarious thing. They're just a piece of technology, like building cars or phonographs or Xerox machines. Yeah. Well, I can think of some destructive things done with Xerox machines, but I won't go there now. But sure, and you can do destructive things with cars. I mean, run them through people and stuff like that. I mean, anything can be misused. To say nothing of things that are obviously meant to be destructive, like guns and bombs and so forth. But robots, would not normally just be malevolent for no reason. I mean, somebody could make one to be malevolent. It's like some kind of war machine or advanced soldier that just goes in totally unafraid, and it doesn't care if it gets blown away because, it has no love of self itself. It is a machine. Like all the things we send out into space that will never, ever find their way back to Earth. They are irrevocably gone from this planet. Some of the space probes we send out. What does the machine care? It doesn't sit there and say, I'm so lonely. I wish I could find my way back to Earth. That's where I came from. They're machines. They're lumps of metal and stuff. There's some computing hardware on there, but none of it even thinks to feel lonely. It just looks for what it can or look what it can do. But somehow, despite his very good efforts in this direction, and I think a very real trend in a lot of the human consciousness in general about robots, the idea of a Frankenstein complex was pretty much over with. People didn't think of robots as something dangerous or bad, unless somebody programmed them that way. But that's not what happened here. For some reason, he never really quite got over that. He was still thinking like, there's going to be all this superstition and stuff like that. And so, I guess the U.S., Artificial Men and whatever corporation, United States Robots and Mechanical Men Incorporated. I don't have such a problem remembering the name of the company. The one that Susan Calvin worked for. But we're now looking at an age that comes clearly after Susan Calvin has not only left, but died. As even mentioned, there's a hologram of her hanging up on his wall in his office, always staring down at him. I just kind of picture those faces that carve inward that seem to follow you as you walk by, But probably really like a real hologram. And they're still the same company, and they're having problems. More and more places say, we don't want robots, we don't need them. There's a colony on the moon. They've had robots, but they're now starting to say, we're done with robots, we don't want them anymore. And so suddenly, United States Robots and Mechanical Men Incorporated has got a problem. Their customer base is just drying up. Why? Because people are afraid of robots. They'll turn into monsters. They'll be Frankenstein's monsters all over again. Okay. Well, given that idea, he talks with a robot of him named George 10. This is the 10th one, which would be George 9. Presumably 1 through 8 are more primitive and no concerns here. And he's talking with George 10 about the 3 laws of robotics. And I guess one of the problems here is he wants George 10 to try to do some robotic thinking. Okay. Actually, it's kind of a neat idea to see what he comes up with. And as a matter of fact, he does come up with something rather interesting. Why don't we forget about robots that are humanoid and look like they're ready to replace us or take our place at jobs and other functions that people do, and instead look at robots that are designed completely unlike humans And maybe something small and harmless, something where even the 3 laws could be stripped down, because they're not going to worry about protecting themselves, because they'll be mass produced, and if damage comes to one or another, so what? They don't need to protect themselves. So goodbye, 3rd law. They really don't have very much in the way of commands to obey. Go, stop, do what you're supposed to do, stop what you're doing. That's about it. And they would have to obey those kinds of commands. And then there's just what they're built to do, which would just be pretty much a hard-coded constant, which I'll get to momentarily. And so finally, there's just the 1st law, which really there's extremely little impact these robots could directly have on human beings. At all, really. There's little to nothing they can do to help or save lives. So they can't even prevent a human being from getting injured in some way, even if they're present and they can see the human being is in danger of being injured or killed. There's nothing they, in their extremely limited capacity, would even be capable of doing. Therefore, nothing they could be responsible to have to do per the 1st law. So things can be very stripped down, so they don't have to have full-fledged, big positronic brains just barely fit inside a human-sized cranium. They can have little itty-bitty brains. They can be a full positronic brain, mind you, that can fit in a much smaller frame, and such as a bird brain. So these little bird brain robots, which in fact is what he proposes to do, can be programmed to go hunting, say, a particular kind of insect. Not a bad idea. And he has one built like that, and he demonstrates it. He releases a bunch of fruit flies out of a jar of them that he has, and then he sets the bird, he just tells it, go. And the bird just goes until it's eaten up every one of them. And since it's not really a bird in the real biological sense that actually needs to eat these fruit flies for nutrition, it simply compresses them all into a little pellet, drop that, and there it is in your hand. That's a little tiny pellet made out of the compressed bodies of 50 fruit flies that this bird has captured. And so a little harmless little robot like that, which would be very useful, very productive, very easy for people to accept, very easy for people not to get all a Frankenstein complex worried about, and that this would be like a great wedge to kind of just get people used to the idea of robots, and then later we can expand back out. So it's this great idea, and he comes up with that idea. And then at the end, a very strange thing happens. Well, humanoid-type robots are no longer to be made. There will keep on hand some of the ones they have made, but they just stay in their laboratories and warehouses and whatnot. They don't go out. They're not for sale. They're not for lease. They're not really available to the public. The public's not going to see them anymore. They're laboratory curiosities from now on, basically, including George's 9 and 10. And they're kind of semi-retired, but they can still kind of sit in a very low level of activity and kind of talk to each other and have these little conversations. And they start going further to the question of what about the 1st law? How do you define a human being? Now, this is something I brought up in a number of the other robot stories, especially the ones collected in iRobot, that when they were originally written, the 2nd law was generally phrased in such a manner that it required an authorized human being, someone specifically designated with the role of being someone who has business telling a robot what to do. So you couldn't just have some random, idiot come walking by and tell a robot to burn its circuits out and go on its merry little way, and the robot, that's command 2, I have to do it. Protecting myself is only the 3rd law. Well, 2nd has precedence, so I'll just short out all my circuits. And it's useless. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think how easy it would be to destroy a robot just by ordering it to short out its own circuits, or some other stupid or destructive thing. As long as it doesn't harm any human beings. Oh yeah, well, what if you order it to start, torturing little animals or something? You'll just go and do it. 2nd law, and they're not humans, so 1st law doesn't enter in. It's not hurting itself or destroying itself in any meaningful way. It's just a machine doing what it's built to do, carry out orders. Now it's given an order, take this rabbit, slowly tear it to pieces or whatever, and off it goes. It doesn't have a conscience. It doesn't have, it doesn't think of feeling guilty. It just does what it's ordered to do. It's a machine. And so, there's definitely some real oversights in the three laws. And of course, a lot of the stories about these oversights. But you see, that was the original form, that it had to be a duly authorized human being, someone who had business ordering a robot around. But when the three laws got put in their final form, now they read, let's just look at that second law. A robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings, except for such orders would conflict with the first law. Human beings, open-ended, no specification. It could be a wise man or an idiot, a child, or it could be somebody who's intelligent and responsible and knows the proper way to do stuff, without any bad side effects, or just any random nobody, who might even be capable of making serious mistakes. The guy who told the robot to destroy this machine and all memory of it, and suddenly that's what it does, and then we'll never know how to build something powerful enough to shear off the top of a mountain, all powered with a couple of regular D-cell batteries. If you remember the AL-76 robot. So we had to get into the point of there being something authored. Well, that went out, and now suddenly, how wasn't that a problem? He has to kind of build an explanation into the dialogue that, to the effect that, well, the robots were out in space and remote places and so forth, and therefore places that A, weren't around just ordinary random human beings, and B, only exposed to human beings who are trained in using them to achieve what they need to do, and have, will not give them false or superfluous or silly or destructive orders. They know how to tell them what to do that's reasonable and useful, and why we have robots out there, despite the expense and everything involved in making them and distributing them here and there where we want them. So that was why it wasn't a problem. But somehow those remote places are no longer remote. There's people. There's lots of people. A robot doing stuff on the moon by itself, even shearing off mountaintops for whatever reason it's supposed to do that, was one thing, because the only human being out there is going to be somebody who knows how to tell the robot what to do. But now, you see, you've got a whole lunar colony, probably with, kids and different things and people and different roles and so forth, and all the different members of society. You've got a problem there. Because any one of those human beings could just randomly walk up to such a robot that's on the moon and tell it to, whatever, and it could be very, very silly, destructive, even accidentally injurious in ways that, well, it didn't hurt any human being, so it didn't break the first law, or at least it didn't look like something that should have hurt any human beings, and that's good enough. So, with that said, they have to try to define, well, maybe there are some human beings, and this is, Georges 9 and 10 talking, well, maybe some humans are more important than others. Well, how do you even define a human being? Is it that he's made of flesh? I mean, we've already had stories where portions of human beings, their heart and other things, are replaced with, robotic type, pieces. So they're not really all flesh, you see? So who's to say whether, you count as a human being? Well, you have to weigh them. You have to measure them. Now suddenly it's up to the robot to decide which human being is more worth listening to than the other human being. And if you can define a human being in terms of this kind of knowledge, and not in terms of anything biological or engineering standpoint, but just by how they are, then robots would be the most human of the human beings, therefore the most worth protecting, probably therefore the most worth obeying, which is kind of interesting, since robots generally do not obey other robots unless they can be made to mistake the robot for a human. So this comes up in several like Elijah Bailey stories, by the way. They think, robot Daniel Olival is a human, so he can issue orders to the robots, and they simply obey, as they would have obeyed Elijah Bailey. And then it's not possible. And then later on, it's exposed that he is a robot. See, he's got mechanical parts inside, not human parts. He's a robot. And then suddenly the robot just disregards him. I don't take any orders from a robot. I can't even give orders coming from a human being that the robot is conveying to me because, well, I don't know why, but it doesn't have to follow it. If it's not directly from a human being to the robot, it's not, it doesn't need to be obeyed. I mean, this is, a lot of the stuff was kind of, it was an interesting first pass. I'll give it that. Very good pass, actually, all said and told. But as we've explored all these things in all these stories, we've actually explored the limitations of the three laws. And now I've come up against the worst. If you can define as a human being, anything that is capable of giving rational commands, and the more rational, the more human, if you had to weigh one as against the other, then probably from a robot standpoint, another robot, well programmed, might well be more human than any or most humans, actual humans, it meets up with, and is therefore more important. And Georges 9 and 10 are quietly talking this stuff to each other, and they finally make this reference at the end to a law of humanics. No more laws of robotics, laws of humanics. They just mentioned that, and it was like, we're taking over. Ay, ay, ay. We're gonna. So here's Asimov, who's done so much to destroy the Frankenstein complex that he's really done it. And now he's writing about these two robots, contemplating about regarding themselves, each other, and their fellow robots. It's more important to listen to, obey, to protect by first and second laws than actual humans. Even really good, wise, well-trained and disciplined humans who know how to handle robots, they're still not quite up to the level of the robots. And therefore, if you have to go between one and the other, you take the robots command over the imperfect humans command. So this is a very odd story for him. There's only one other odd and small point I notice in here. It actually makes a very fleeting mention of you have on your desk a computer input which, I understand, is connected with the organization's multivac. A computer is a kind of sessile robot, a brain not attached to a body, blah, blah, blah. This is therefore also a multivac story, which among all the Susan Calvin type robot stories of the robot universe, we've never, up till this point, seen multivac mentioned in any of those. So that's kind of a first. I don't know. Make of that what you will. So it's been a fun story. It did get collected into the Bicentennial Man and other stories. I haven't been able to discern any textual differences. So there it is, readily available in that book. Of course, all robot stories are also up to 1982-ish or thereabouts are collected into The Complete Robot, another book. But anyway, enough on that. Thanks for listening.